He was a man who wore two faces. To the world, he was a father, a provider, a man with a family he built from the ground up. But in the shadows, he carried secrets, secrets that would burn everything he touched. His hands clenched tightly, tension radiating from within as he struggled with his secrets. He started with love, or at least what he thought was love. It was a desperate, grasping kind of affection, born from a lifetime of its absence. He met Sarah, and in her eyes, he saw not just a woman, but a future, a clean slate. She was the architect of a normal life, and he was her most eager client. For her, he was a project of redemption, a man with sad eyes and a gentle touch, who just needed the right kind of foundation to build upon. Their courtship was a whirlwind of calculated normalcy. Picnics in the park, late-night talks about picket fences, and the shared dream of a life that looked like the ones on television. He wasn't just falling for her, he was falling for the blueprint she offered, a chance to construct an identity far from the ruins of his own origin. Their vows, spoken in a small courthouse ceremony, weren't just promises to each other. They were his solemn oath to outrun the ghosts of his past, to build a fortress of family so impenetrable that no darkness could ever seep through. And for a while, the fortress held. He had children, a son named Leo and a daughter Maya, who carried his smile as if it were their birthright. The first time he held Leo, he felt a tectonic shift within him. This tiny, helpless being was tangible proof of his transformation. He was no longer the abandoned boy. He was a father, a creator, a patriarch. Every milestone was another brick in the wall against his past. The first mortgage on a house he couldn't really afford, the endless cycle of diapers and scraped knees, the scent of pancakes and cartoons that filled their Saturday mornings. He mastered the rituals of fatherhood, reading bedtime stories with a practiced cadence and cheering from the sidelines of their games. The household echoed with a laughter that was, for the most part, genuine. The growing pains were a welcome distraction, a sign of a living, breathing family. For a time, the performance of being a good man was so convincing, so all-encompassing, that it felt almost indistinguishable from the real thing. The life he had built was his sanctuary. To the outside world, the illusion was perfect. To neighbors, they were the ideal family. He was the dad who always had the best-kept lawn, the husband who remembered anniversaries and brought home flowers. He coached Leo's t-ball team, a sport he secretly despised, learning the rules and feigning an enthusiasm that earned him nods of approval from the other parents. He built Maya a dollhouse from scratch, spending weeks in the garage sanding and painting. The meticulous labor a form of penance for a crime he hadn't yet committed. These weren't just gestures of love, they were alibis. Each act of paternal devotion was a carefully placed stone in the mosaic of the perfect family man. A portrait designed to convince everyone, most of all himself, that the boy he once was had been fully and finally erased. The Christmas mornings were the grandest performance of all, a spectacle of commercial excess, a mountain of toys to bury the memory of his own empty childhoods, a desperate attempt to purchase the happiness he couldn't genuinely feel. But behind the smile, the void remained. It was a hunger that no amount of domestic bliss could satiate, a restless spirit that paced the gilded cage he had so carefully constructed. It began as a quiet hum of dissatisfaction, a feeling of being an imposter at his own dinner table. Then it grew louder. The laughter of his children began to sound like a demand. The loving touch of his wife started to feel like a tether. The restlessness became a physical itch, a desperate need for an escape hatch. It led to long drives with no destination, the darkness of the open road a welcome reprieve from the bright, warm light of his home. It led to late nights at the office that were really just hours spent sitting in his car in an empty parking lot, the silence a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. He was an actor who had forgotten his lines, improvising his way through days that felt increasingly hollow, the applause of his perfect life ringing false in his ears. This was the same spirit that once lived in a boy abandoned by his own mother and father, two souls swallowed by the twin demons of drugs and prison time. He could still conjure the smell of stale cigarette smoke and decay that clung to his mother's clothes the last time he saw her. He could still feel the cold floorboards of the empty apartment, the silence stretching for days until a neighbor finally called the authorities. He remembered the cold, impersonal click of the handcuffs on his father's wrists, a sound that became the punctuation mark at the end of his childhood. What followed was a blur of institutional gray. Social workers with tired eyes, a succession of foster homes, each with its own set of arbitrary rules and its own brand of quiet indifference. He learned early and brutally that attachment was a liability, that love was a currency he didn't possess. So the boy built walls not of brick and mortar but of silence and detachment, a fortress to protect a heart that had already been shattered into 1,000 pieces. He swore he'd never be like them. That vow was the singular animating principle of his entire adult life. He would be present. He would be stable. He would provide. But he had confused presence with proximity, stability with suffocating routine. He was in the house, but he was no longer in the home. And the pain of abandonment doesn't just vanish with a promise. It is a poison in the bloodline, a genetic mutation of the soul. It lies dormant for years, festering in the quiet moments, waiting for a moment of weakness. It twists love into resentment and commitment into a cage. And eventually that pain, that ancient inherited pain, demands an exit. It demands to be passed on, not through the sudden violence of physical departure, but through the slow, corrosive drip of emotional absence, a void that is, in its own way, just as deep and just as devastating. He was becoming a ghost in the machine he built, and his children, sleeping soundly in their beds, were just beginning to learn how to live with a haunting. By the time the cracks in his double life began to show, the architecture he'd built was already trembling. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing surrender to the weight of his own secrets. For years, he had been a master of compartmentalization, a juggler with too many balls in the air. There was the life everyone knew, the sprawling suburban house, the 2 children, Leo and Maya, who bore his smile, and the wife who had been his partner in building that world from the ground up. She was the anchor, the steady hand, the keeper of schedules and memories. But there was another life, one he kept hidden even from himself, a life that included a 3rd child, born outside the boundaries of his marriage. This 3rd child, a living reminder of his divided loyalties, existed on the periphery, a secret shadow that haunted every family photograph, every holiday, every moment of supposed normalcy. The tension grew with every lie, every excuse, every moment he was physically present but emotionally absent. He stood in the hospital room, watching the monitors beep, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. This wasn't a moment of joy. It was terror, laced with a profound, aching love for the family he was about to lose, and a guilt that gnawed at him for the 3rd child he could never fully claim. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his wife, asking when he'd be home for dinner. A simple question that felt like an accusation. He was a ghost in his own home, a king of a crumbling kingdom, and the strain of wearing 2 faces was finally crushing him. Down the hall, his wife sat in a waiting room, her face a beautiful, heartbreaking canvas of emotions. There was the overwhelming love for her family, but beneath it, a tremor of uncertainty, a vulnerability she tried to hide whenever he was near. She had believed his promises, or perhaps had chosen to believe them. Promises of a future, of a life together, whispered in the dark. She saw him as her savior, the man who saw her when she felt invisible. She didn't know she was losing him to secrets she could never name. She believed she was the one who had finally captured his restless heart. She could not imagine the existence of a 3rd child, a secret that would unravel everything she thought she knew. And so, in that quiet room, another fragile heartbeat in a world built on lies. The children, Leo and Maya, innocent and unaware, and the mother, whose entire world was balanced on the word of a man who was a stranger to the truth. And somewhere else, a 3rd child, his own flesh and blood, grew up in the shadow of his absence, never knowing the warmth of his embrace, only the ache of unanswered questions. He could have confessed. The thought flickered through his mind, a brief, terrifying moment of clarity. He could have walked into his home, sat down with the woman who had given him years of her life, and simply told the truth. He pictured the scene, the shattering of her world, the confusion turning to horror in her eyes, the questions from Leo and Maya that he would never be able to answer. And what of the 3rd child, the one whose very existence would be a wound too deep to heal, the sheer, unadulterated pain of it all. He told himself it would be an act of cruelty, a selfish unburdening that would serve only to ease his own conscience at the expense of their peace. He framed his cowardice as a final, misguided act of mercy. It would destroy them, he whispered to his reflection in the darkened window. So he chose a different path, not the clean, sharp cut of a surgeon's blade, but the blunt, brutal force of a demolition crew. He didn't confess. No, he stirred chaos instead. It began subtly, a slow poisoning of the air in their home. He became a critic, a fault finder. The dinner she'd spent hours preparing was suddenly bland. The way she laughed was too loud. The stories the children told about their day were boring. He manufactured conflict from the thin air of domestic life, turning mundane moments into battlegrounds. "Why do you always have to put the keys there? You know I can never find them," he'd snap, his voice laced with a venom that was entirely new. He was planting seeds of doubt, not just about her actions, but about her sanity. Gaslighting became his native tongue. "I never said that. You're imagining things. You're being hysterical." He would twist her words, deny her reality, until she began to question her own memory, her own perceptions. She would lie awake at night, replaying their conversations, trying to pinpoint the moment their love had curdled into this constant low-grade warfare. He was picking fights with the woman who loved him, creating arguments out of nothing, blaming, gaslighting, tearing at the very foundation of the home he had helped build, until the first cracks appeared in the plaster, and soon the walls themselves began to fall. All the while, the secret of his third child pressed on him, a silent accomplice to the destruction. The final argument was a masterpiece of destruction. It was about nothing and everything, a culmination of weeks of manufactured tension. It erupted in the kitchen, the heart of their home, and its ferocity left nothing unscathed. Words were thrown like stones, accusations hurled like grenades. He painted her as the villain, the architect of his unhappiness, the cage that kept him from being the man he was meant to be. He watched her break, saw the fight finally leave her eyes, replaced by a hollow, wounded resignation. And in that moment, he saw his opening. This was the excuse he had been building, the justification he needed. He used those arguments as his exit. In the cold, ringing silence that followed the storm, he packed a single bag, a few shirts, a toothbrush, the hollowed-out essentials of a life he was leaving behind. He didn't look at the family photos on the mantelpiece, didn't touch the small, handmade "I love you, Daddy" card taped to the refrigerator. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge the enormity of his betrayal. He turned his back on the children who carried his name, the ones who were huddled in their rooms, listening to the sounds of their world collapsing. He couldn't face them, couldn't bear to see the confusion and hurt in their eyes. He offered no explanation, no final hug, no promise of return. He simply walked out the door, a coward fleeing the scene of the crime. From the upstairs window, two small faces watched his car's taillights disappear down the street, a receding constellation of red in the gathering dusk. For months, they would continue that vigil, the ones who waited at the window for him to come home, a hope that dwindled with every passing sunset, until it was just a ghost of a memory. And somewhere else, another child waited too. This time, the third child, waiting for him to finally come home and be a family. Instead, he drove across town, not looking back, and stepped into a new life of solitude. He poured himself into the quiet rhythm of being alone, haunted by the echoes of the family he left behind. The late-night silences, the empty rooms, the absence of laughter. He embraced it all with a desperate, almost manic devotion to forgetting. This, he told himself, was his chance at redemption. A clean slate. He was a different man here. He was patient. He was present. He was everything he had failed to be in his other life. At least, that's what he tried to believe. He built a fortress of new routines and new memories, hoping its walls would be thick enough to muffle the echoes of the past. He tried to convince himself that the man who had just abandoned his wife and children didn't exist anymore, that he had been shed like a snake's skin, that maybe, just maybe, he could start over. But the truth of the third child lingered, a silent thread tying him to the life he could never truly escape. But a man running from his own reflection can't escape the mirror forever. The past is not a place you can leave behind. It's a passenger you carry within you. He would see it in fleeting moments. A glimpse of his own face in a shop window would startle him. The face of a stranger, haunted and worn. He'd hear a child's laughter in a park, and his heart would seize. The sound of phantom limb he could still feel. He'd catch a feature in a stranger's face, the curve of an eyebrow, the shape of a hand. That was a perfect echo of Leo or Maya, or perhaps the third child he barely knew, and the guilt would be a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He was living on borrowed time, in a house built on a fault line. The reflection he was fleeing wasn't just in the glass, it was in the eyes of the people he'd left behind, and it was etched into the soul of the man he was trying so desperately not to be. The new beginning was an illusion, a beautifully constructed lie, and the truth was a debt, patiently waiting to be collected. To his family, he was an anchor. The man who carved the Thanksgiving turkey, who taught Leo to throw a baseball and read bedtime stories to Maya. They saw the provider, the pillar of strength who left before sunrise and returned after dusk, his fatigue a testament to his hard work. He was an architect of perception, building a fortress of normalcy around them. They saw the life he had built and felt safe within its walls, but a house built on a fractured foundation is destined to crumble. The family didn't know the full truth, because the truth was a version of him they would never recognize. Nobody in his sunlit world did. The late nights at the office became a common refrain, a plausible shield. The business trips to cities they'd never visit, the old friends they'd never meet. Each excuse was a carefully laid stone on a path leading far away from home. Behind the tired smiles and plausible explanations, he carried a secret so heavy it threatened to split him in two. It was a hunger, a compulsion that gnawed at the edges of his carefully constructed reality, a part of himself he deemed too dark for the light of day. As dusk settled, another man would emerge. He would drive past the familiar landmarks of his life and cross an invisible line into a different existence. Here, under the buzz of neon and the anonymity of the crowd, he shed his identity like a snake sheds its skin. He was living on the down low, a ghost in a world of ghosts, chasing desires he had suppressed for a lifetime. It was a world of clandestine meetings in dimly lit bars, of fleeting connections in the back rooms of nameless clubs. This was not about love. It was about erasure. The erasure of the husband, the father, the man with responsibilities. He moved through these shadows with a desperate urgency, a man running from himself, convinced that as long as nobody from his world could see him, it wasn't really happening. This was his release, his poison, his silent rebellion. But secrets are never truly silent. They leave trails. It started subtly. A persistent fatigue he blamed on work, a fever that wouldn't break, night sweats that drenched his sheets. He ignored the signs, pushing them down with the same force he used to suppress his desires. But the body keeps a score that the mind cannot erase. The fear finally grew louder than his denial. He found himself in the sterile quiet of a clinic, the air thick with unspoken anxieties. The words from the doctor were calm, clinical, and utterly devastating. They landed not like a sentence, but like an execution. He contracted HIV. The 3 letters hung in the air, rewriting his past and erasing his future in a single, brutal moment. The diagnosis should have been a full stop, but shame is a powerful paralytic. The terror of confession was greater than the terror of the disease itself. So he chose silence, a catastrophic, selfish silence. And in his recklessness, desperate to maintain the illusion, he continued his path of destruction. He didn't just carry a virus, he became one. But it was not his wife who bore the cost. He left her and the children behind, turning instead to the woman who had been waiting in the shadows, his third child's mother. It was to her, in the hope of a new beginning, that he brought both his presence and his secret. She was planning a life with him, trusting in the promise of a family, never knowing the danger that came with his love. And she wasn't the only one. There were others, other women he touched, other lives he irrevocably altered, weaving a web of contagion and deceit. He left behind scars that went far beyond the physical, the deep, jagged wounds of betrayal, the stigma that would follow them, the theft of their futures. These were scars no one could see and no one could ever erase. The human spirit can only carry so much before it splinters. The weight of it all began to press down on him, a physical, crushing force. It was the weight of the thousands of lies, each one a stone added to the pile on his back. It was the weight of the faces of the women he had betrayed, their trusting eyes haunting him. It was the weight of the disease itself, a constant cellular reminder of his choices, a traitor living inside his own blood. The lies became a labyrinth he could no longer navigate. The betrayals echoed in every empty room. The disease was the final, undeniable truth in a life built on fiction. He was no longer just a man with a secret. He was a man consumed by it. The decay was no longer just internal. It began to manifest, to etch itself onto his physical form. His body, once strong and vital, began to weaken, surrendering to the relentless assault of the virus. The pounds melted away, leaving his clothes hanging on a skeletal frame. His face, once handsome and confident, hollowed out, his cheekbones sharp, his eyes sinking into dark, cavernous sockets. His spirit, once a blazing fire of ambition, fractured into a million pieces, leaving only embers of despair. The man who once commanded rooms, who seemed so untouchable, became a fragile shell. He was a ghost haunting the hallways of his own home, a stranger to his own children, a walking testament to the devastating cost of a hidden life. He was walking, but he was irrevocably broken. The children he left behind felt the sting of abandonment, the same sting he swore he'd never pass on. They grew up asking questions, wondering why he chose another family, carrying wounds they didn't deserve. Their pain was the echo of his own childhood repeating like a curse. But curses can be broken. Years later, paths crossed. The one child he couldn't erase, the one whose face haunted his memory, stood before him. By then, he was unrecognizable. The swagger was gone. His voice trembled. His body carried the marks of disease, his mind clouded, his soul heavy with regret. He tried to speak, tried to explain. But what words can heal decades of betrayal? What apology can reach a heart carved open by absence? Yet in that moment, there was something powerful. Because the child he abandoned, the one he thought he broke, was still standing. Stronger, wiser, saved. He was a man undone. His secrets had caught up. His double life had unraveled. His body was failing. His spirit was empty. The faces of the children he left behind replayed in his mind, and he saw in them the little boy he once was, the one left behind by a mother and father lost to drugs and prison. He had become the very thing he hated. And now, all that was left was the weight of his own reflection. Single empty chair in minimal light, symbolic absence and void, slow, subtle camera hold. This was the story of a man who lived in the shadows, a man who thought he could build love on lies, a man who thought he could run from the pain of his past only to repeat it. He left behind broken hearts, but in the end, it was his own heart that was shattered the most. Because no matter how many families he built, how many faces he hid behind, the truth remained. A man can't escape the child he once was. And if he never heals that child, he'll only pass the wound down again. And again, until there's nothing left but silence.